Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Connecticut Psychological Association Social Justice Speaker Series. I'm delighted to say that our esteemed speaker tonight is Dr. Robert Bourgeois. Dr. Bourgeois' talk title is Anthropology and Race, the Boys' School and the Dismantling of Racial Hierarchy. A warm welcome, Dr. Bourgeois.
Thank you.
My name is Shiva, and I serve as the chair of the Social Justice Committee at the Connecticut Psychological Association. Joining me today are our passionate social justice social justice members, Anne, Kyler, Sydney, and Andrew. As always, I express sincere appreciation to our sponsors. Their support is the cornerstone of our ability to sustain these series. I'm going to share with you the slides of our donors. As you see here, at the platinum level, we have comprehensive neuropsychological services who have supported us for the 4th consecutive year. And I'm proud to say that I'm affiliated with this company. Also, the CPA Educational Foundation has helped us for the 2nd consecutive year. Additionally, you see your beautiful names in the bronze and supporters level. Thanks everyone for participating and for your support. Now I'm going to turn it over to Kyler to share additional information about the series.
Thank you, Shiva. So on behalf of the Planning Committee, we are thrilled that you could join us this evening. And we sincerely hope that you'll continue to attend our future speaker sessions. And of course, we're enthusiastic about Dr. Bourgeois' presentation this evening as well. And as a brief reminder before we get started, our CPA Social Justice Speaker Series offers these free monthly meetings to CPA members, the wider Connecticut community, and our nationwide supporters. So I welcome you to our speaker series this evening. And so now what I'm going to do is turn it back over to Shiva to share our speaker's biography with you.
Thank you, Kyler. So Dr. Robert Bourgeois is professor of anthropology, humanities and religion in the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Albertus Magnus College. Professor Bourgeois served with the Peace Corps for 2 years in Ivory Coast in West Africa, working with village health committees towards the prevention of infectious diseases. He received his Ph.D. in anthropology at the University of Chicago and has done research on pre-modern societies for the Center for the Study of the Economy and the State at the University of Chicago and for Encyclopedia Britannica. His courses at Albertus combine history, culture, and religion to understand topics such as Islam and the West and popular movements of liberation in Latin America. In 2014, prompted by a student outrage in the aftermath of a series of killings of unarmed Black men by police, he founded the Student Faculty Justice Panel, a public event which twice a year evaluates instances of institutionalized injustice in light of Catholic social teaching. It is now my honor to invite Dr. Bourgeois to lead us through what promises to be an insightful and inspiring presentation. Dr. Bourgeois, the platform is yours.
Thank you very much, Shiva. I'd like to just interject that the Justice Panel that Shiva referred to, Shiva has been a staunch supporter. She's a member of the advisory committee and is invaluable. And so I appreciate this. And also, I think it's fitting to talk about anthropology to the Psychological Association because they grew up at the same time. I'm talking about modern, scientifically oriented anthropology and psychology. They grew up at pretty much the same time, and there have been many attempts at linkage throughout the year. throughout the years, and they are a natural overlapping. So I'm going to start with a statement, and then I would like to present some slides and discuss. So in the early part of the 20th century, a band of scholars created an intellectual revolution that produced modern anthropology. It was an American achievement led by a German Jewish immigrant. The judgment of any achievement must be measured against the obstacles it must overcome. An analogy might help in this regard. The discovery of Nicholas Copernicus that the sun and not the earth is the center of the universe did not simply add
Karen, are you sitting down?
knowledge.
Next time you're up, would you bring me a glass of water?
Okay, somebody needs to be.
You're good, Dr. Bourgeois.
All right. The discovery of Copernicus that the sun and not the earth is the center of the universe did not simply add a new increment of knowledge. It was a scientific revolution which shattered a worldview, destabilized society, produced philosophical, religious, political, and cultural revolutions, and set in train 4 centuries of accelerating change that produced the modern world view, materialistic, skeptical, individualistic, and secular. Humans no longer had a centering cosmology. They no longer saw themselves as the center of God's concern. They were no place special in a vast, mechanical, lifeless universe whose operations needed neither God nor humans to explain them. The Copernican revolution was a revolution in underlying, taken for granted assumptions. In like manner, 19th century anthropology, a relatively new discipline but drawing upon centuries of social thought and practice, explained the diversity of peoples and the inequality between rulers and ruled as resting on differences in the essential nature of those peoples. Close empirical observation and measurement of the physical features of different peoples who were grouped into a category called races correlated with mental, emotional, linguistic, and moral capacities, which were innate in each race, acquired by heredity, and immutable. 2 paradigmatic assumptions were that European civilization was the pinnacle of human development, and that some races were by nature incapable of attaining to the European level of perfection. Since the innateness of European superiority and of the inferiority of other races was passed on by means of heredity, a causal assumption held that if a person of the highest race intermingled with one of a lower race, the offspring would belong to the lower race and often be defective. Prescriptive assumptions that followed were the imperative for the higher races not to mingle and reproduce with the lower races, and the necessity of segregating the lower races from the higher to prevent the production of defectives. All peoples on Earth were passing through a linear progression of 3 stages of development, and the task of the science of man was to collect the artifacts and physical measurements of people to situate them in the appropriate stage along the path to civilization. The Boas circle, through rigorous empirical research, disconnected the asserted link between outward physical features and inner mental life, and exposed the 3-stage model to be illusory. The so-called savage mind was shown to be capable of symbolic language, sophisticated reasoning, and abstract thought. Decades of scholarly research and publication in both scholarly works and popular books and articles resulted in a collapse of the 19th century evolutionary framework of the racial hierarchy of mankind, a decentering of the American and European way of doing things as a universal standard, and a rethinking of race away from a biologically determined essence to a social construct. Humans are cultural animals who believe in the categories and follow the rules of their own making, even if they are unaware of these rules, which are rooted in often unconscious assumptions. The Boas Circle was promoting these insights in a nation that, in Charles King's words, had perfected a vast system of racial disenfranchisement that governed every aspect of American life. It took time and persistence for the notion that culture, and not biology, was fundamental to human mental life, and that all peoples possessed the capacity for culture. This insight had to be demonstrated academically before it could take root in popular common sense assumptions and in public policy and institutional frameworks. So this process is still going on. It's still unfolding. Now I'm going to share. I'm unable to show. Oh, here we go. The first, second, and fourth images represent cultures that were investigated by the Boas school, and I'll talk about who that is in a minute. The third one is from Benin. How do we explain the diversity of human types in the world? How did different varieties of humans come about? Are we many kinds of humans or a single humanity? This question became an almost obsessive focus of social thought and natural history and the beginnings of anthropology in the 18th and 19th centuries. Just as background, because this is part of the story, I don't go into this, but just as background and context, what we're looking at here is the proportion of the world that was colonized. I mean, between 1814 and 1914, the percentage of peoples who were governed by European and Western colonialism was 85% of the world. And we are living in a post-colonial era. And that history is relevant to our story tonight, but I'm not going to go into that. I just wanted to include this as contextual information. So from noble savage to inferior race, 18th and 19th century. The Enlightenment view earlier on, following Rousseau and others, postulated a kind of innocent, noble peoples of the past. It was kind of a golden age of Eden before we fell out of Eden into the real world and were cast out. However, this shifted in the 19th century. So if you look at these two columns, the 18th century was characterized by Enlightenment optimism. Human nature was considered everywhere to be the same. And now this began in the 18th century and persisted right into the 20th, that all peoples evolved through a linear progression towards civilization. And this was determined by nature. It was sort of evolutionary determinism, cultural evolutionary determinism. It was assumed by all that Europe was the pinnacle of civilization, but for some mysterious reasons, not all groups had progressed at the same rate. But human nature was fundamentally the same, and natural law would guide all peoples to the perfection of European society. However, as colonialism gathered strength and Westerners throughout the world were encountering peoples that they had never known, whose languages and cultures were so different from their own, the gap between Europeans and others was deemed to be too wide for us to really belong to one single race. Oh, that word was not, that word was just about to come into specific, a very specific definition. Race before had been used loosely. It could mean a linguistic group, an ethnic group, a geographical area, a musical society. It was used for all these things. But this was the age of empiricism and scientism. Everything had to be put into clear and distinct ideas, and mostly everything had to be empirically measured. And so inferior races, or all races, we had to determine which people belong to which race. And this must involve measurement. It was assumed and proposed that inferior races have compressed skulls so that the brain could not fully develop. It began in France and then spread to England, but French anthropology essentially became anthropometry, which means the measurement of the human. And the most vigorous expounder of civilizational evolution was Herbert Spencer. And he declared that the savage lacks abstract ideas, and that's because the savage's brain cannot fully develop. And only white people actually can attain to civilization. And as a result of this, in the United States in the 19th century, American anthropology pretty much became craniology. In other words, measurements of the cranium. Other measurements were important too, such as the length of the femur and other physical features. But measurement of the cranium was universal. And it was a standard part of anthropology. In the 18th century, this word racial ideology, I would not use that phrase. I would say racial theory. But it was, prior to Darwin, the origin of the human race was explained in two different ways. And these two different ways were called monogenism and polygenism. And monogenism means that everyone had the same origin. It was still a very Christian society, and so this was religiously based, because all humans had a single origin from Adam and Eve. But that over time, with the fall of man, came the degradation of the race. The different races are seen as being due to environmentally determined degeneration from Europeans. The other school, polygenism, is that the people belong to different races. And they're either descendants of different Adams or separate creations. Now, after Darwin, one might think that this division became irrelevant, because Darwin demonstrated that all life is one, that all life comes from a common ancestor. He didn't have cell biology at the time, but he could have added that all life proceeds through the same genetic code. So what happened? After Darwin, polygenism and its ideas had a resurgence rather than disappear. And the reasoning was that by the time humans had developed their full intellectual capacity, they had already gone through a process of natural selection, which had divided the human species into subcategories, some of which were more fit than others. And so there actually were different races. You may recall that I said that it was standard theory that all humans go through 3 stages. And these were called savagery, barbarism, and civilization. these phrases were not invented, but defined by Lewis Henry Morgan, who was actually one of the great founders of anthropology. He lived in the 19th century. He lived in upstate New York, was a lawyer, and he became fascinated with the Iroquois and the Iroquoian peoples. And he took a great interest in them and promoted their protection, and in fact studied their institutions and created a society of scholars who wanted to reproduce the way they governed themselves and protected themselves from tyranny. So he was very progressive, and he wrote pioneering studies. And one of the things he did was he was a profound student of kinship terminology. And so he's really the founder of the scientific study of kinship terminology, which has evolved from that beginning to now. But he believed in this comprehensive framework of social evolution. So everybody has to pass, all the peoples of the world belong somewhere in this scheme. So notice that his titles are defined by the material basis of the society. So savagery are hunter-gatherers. Barbarism means settled life, markets, some agriculture, and chiefs and warrior kingdoms. The agricultural revolution has occurred. And then civilization, we might call that now industrial civilization, but urban life, flowering of the arts and architecture. And they filled these in with much more detail. There were subcategories. So what anthropologists felt their job was after measuring people and looking at their artifacts and doing a comprehensive study of their way of life, gathering all of their material products and their songs and their folktales, was to place them in this scheme somewhere. They all belong somewhere. Sometimes someone might belong to barbarism, but there were survivals from the savagery period, so they would be combinations. So the doctrine of survivals became a part of this scheme. These are survivals within a society of an earlier period when they had not progressed as far. This is kind of the way we look at things now. We would call these prehistory. Civitas is civilization. Is the root of city is the root of the word civilization, or city is the root of the word civilization, right? And modernity. So this is a different way. And why I'm showing this is because some anthropologists are eager to throw all evolutionary frameworks away, but I think that a kind of evolution of material technology and of ecological knowledge and mastery of it is appropriate and helpful. I think this is a generally accepted picture of the three levels of a society: a material level, a societal level, and I would call this the symbolic level. The symbolic level, this is where humans live in an imagined world of their own creation, and they formulate the meaning of these two other dimensions at this level of symbolic understanding. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But some factors of this is that society is structured, that culture is pervasive, and that over time, if a proper adaptation or if a successful adaptation has occurred to the environment, it's integrated. This is Herbert Spencer, and this is E.B. Tyler, another father of anthropology. So they use the so-called comparative method, and I've just described that. Comparing cultures across the world and arranging them in a linear evolutionary sequence, essentially viewing primitive societies as living examples of extinct societies of the past. And that would allow them to reconstruct the progression of human culture from savagery to civilization. According to Tyler, one thing Tyler did, he contributed a definition of culture that got things moving toward a more modern understanding. He called culture that complex whole, which includes knowledge, belief, art, law, morals, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. So it's a comprehensive definition, and the key thing is that culture is learned, so it's a product of society. Just to remind you, I cannot see what the number of these slides, and you can't either, can you? All right. This is just a reminder of the thinking that was universal in learned societies here and abroad about the three stages. So all of these people, so these would be at the lower stages. This is barbarism, and this is civilization. So let's talk about the person who changed the paradigm, Franz Boas, 1858 to 1942. He grew up in a liberal Jewish, very assimilated family, upper middle class, and he was ambitious. He wanted to become a public intellectual. And it was the age of discovery and the age of expeditions. So he got funding from his family and from a grant to make an expedition, and he went to the Baffin Islands. He went to the University of Kiel, where he got a Ph.D. in geography and physics. So very scientifically oriented. While there, it was customary in what would later become Germany to engage in duels and to have as a badge of honor or a mark of honor scars from those duels. He ended up with several scars on his forehead and his cheek. Later on, he had an operation to correct the severe scar on his cheek, and it was a botched operation, and they cut the nerves, and for the rest of his life, one side of his face hung down. So he had to live with that. He went to live on Baffin Island for a year in freezing temperatures near the Arctic Circle. And this changed his life. You may often hear of anthropologists who experience their field work as a rite of passage. And this is what happened to him. He studied the language, Inuktitut, wrote down extensive descriptions of it. He studied kinship. He learned to build things. He got involved in the material culture. He found himself totally at the mercy of the Inuit. There were many more Inuit than there were Europeans. And he had to depend on them for everything. And he discovered that these were not people who were frozen in time in some primitive and unchanging world of superstition. They were people with a history. They were people who had to plan. They were people who had to devise ingenious strategies to go across vast distances that seemed to a European eye to be completely undifferentiated white color, in order to pursue the seal pods on dog sleds. And these were grueling, sometimes 24-hour hunts. And he said, oops, sorry. I'm trying to get rid of this thing at the bottom. I said, I often ask myself, he wrote in a letter, what advantages our good society possesses over that of the savages, in quotation marks. And the more I see of their customs, I find that we really have no right to look down upon them contemptuously. He also wrote, the greatest single lesson he learned was my notion of the relativity of all education. I want to say that when he grew up and was educated, the ideas of Kant were still very prominent in philosophical thinking. And one of those ideas was that Kant believed that we do not see the world unmediated as it is. When we look at the world, we're not seeing the world as it is. We're seeing it as it's already configured by some kind of manifold in our brain. That the reality we see is actually structured already by things that we bring to it mentally. And these involve the culture that we've grown up in. So that prepared Boas for his later breakthrough that of cultural relativism, as it came to be called. That's what the Boas school invented, that word, or defined it, that word, cultural relativism. He said that he saw that being intelligent was relative to one's circumstances and surroundings. He went Herzenbildung, an education of the heart. And that education of the heart was that enabled him to see the humanity of the other as another human being. Well, in 1885, he emigrated to the United States. He had family here in the United States, and he had fallen in love with someone who lived in upstate New York, part of the Jacobi family. And he wanted to be here. And he got himself a job working for several museums along the Northwest coast. And he did an immense amount of work, and it was very, very productive 2 years. And he studied the languages of the Bella Coola, the Nootka, the Kwakiutl, the Tlingit. Massive documentation. It took him years to write it all up, but it established him as a person for whom anthropology meant you must engage in linguistic study. And he created grammars of these languages. So this laid the groundwork for part of his work with in his whole lifetime was documenting Native American languages and culture. And the work in doing this was kind of an urgent salvage operation, because it was clear that indigenous peoples were under pressure to survive, and that their languages may disappear, and that their cultures may disappear. And so he felt a sense of urgency to protect and preserve them. Now, this was already part of the Bureau of Indian Ethnography in the United States. The United States government had a big agency that was tasked with managing the indigenous people, and they had rich resources for the study of cultures, and Boas was involved in communicating with them and working with them. But they also subscribed to this unilinear cultural evolutionary determinism of the 3 stages. First entries into the fray. He became an assistant editor of a journal, Science, in Washington. And he had the effrontery to criticize, he was just a newcomer, spoke with a heavy accent, but he criticized the organization of the ethnological exhibits at the Smithsonian, which was had already become, had an enormous amount of money, become distinguished. And he said the problem was that all the artifacts, such as spears, homes, were grouped together from many diverse cultures together, because the principle of organization was, do they represent the same phase in the universal cultural evolutionary scheme? So if it's deemed that this weapon and this knife and this carving belong to the stage of savagery, well, you collect similar implements from all over the world and put them all together, no matter what specific individual culture they come from. What was important was that we're looking at examples of savagery. And he objected to this. And he said, you cannot understand any cultural object outside of its sociocultural context. You can't understand the meaning of that object or that artifact unless you know what the meaning is inside the mind of the person who's using it. First at Clark University, Granville Stanley Hall. He met Granville Stanley Hall on a train ride, and they got to talking. And Hall was impressed with him. Hall earned the first Ph.D. in psychology at Harvard in the United States. He was the first president of Clark University. This was a period in the late 19th century where all these oligarchs and millionaires were funding universities, and Clark was one of them. And it was established to be a research institution only on the European model. He founded the American Journal of Psychology in 1887. He founded the American Psychological Association, and in 1889, he invited Boas to teach anthropology at Clark. No one had ever taught anthropology at the university level before. And so he was the first person, Boas, to teach anthropology at the university level in the United States. And his first doctoral student was the first US Ph.D. in anthropology. So G. Stanley Hall and Franz Boas achieved some firsts together. He got discouraged. Boas got discouraged at Clark because they kept running out of money. And the problem was that John D. Rockefeller had founded the University of Chicago in 1892, and he had a lot of money, and he sent the people who ran the institution to go east and poach all the different universities and colleges for talented scholars. And that's what happened to Clark over and over again. They kept losing scholars to Chicago. And Boas got discouraged and left. There were theories about how many races there were. Some said 1, 2, 3, 4. Darwin ridiculed this notion, in which he wrote in a passage of the Origin of Species that he discussed the fact that these theorists of cultural evolution couldn't agree on how many races there were, and he names the number of races associated with each scholar by name from 1 to 15. But at any rate, what was accepted in the United States and became dogma was that there are 5 races: Caucasian, Mongolian or yellow, Malayan or brown, Ethiopian or black, and American or red. And these were examples of the skulls. I wanted to share something with you. Now, to do this, I have to go somewhere here. Hold on with me. And that is the background to this. The 19th century was full of increasingly of obsession with race. And hang on a second, please. I'm looking for this. Yeah. And after Baffin Island, Boas, who started out with treating this as geography and physics, he shifted his approach to include the mental perceptions of the members of the societies under study. And he also, like everyone else, taught the methods of anthropometry or craniometry. That was just part and parcel of the study. He had become curator of anthropology for the Chicago World's Fair, and he was a disciplined field worker. And in 1908, the Dillingham Commission, named after Senator William P. Dillingham of Vermont, contacted Boas to propose that he prepare a report on the immigration of different races into the country. And the context was this: polygenism had become dogma in the United States at the time of unprecedented immigration from China and Southern Europe. And at the end of Reconstruction, Southern lawmakers got back into power and produced a deluge of race-focused legislation, enforcing segregation, outlawing interracial marriage, restricting the right to vote. The Supreme Court issued rulings that made whiteness a legally defined category. The court decisions declared that Chinese, Hawaiians, Burmese, Japanese, Native Americans, Filipinos, and Koreans were not white, and at the same time ruled that Mexicans, Armenians, Asian Indians, and Syrians were Caucasians or white. This affected every institution in the country. Schools, hospitals, neighborhoods, and cemeteries were race restricted. The most influential theory, that there were 5 great races, and a nativist reaction, swept the country. The most progressive voices in the country, and this is a warning to us who think we're progressive, the most progressive voices in the country warned of miscegenation and the dilution of the purity of the white race. Eugenics became the progressive cause of the enlightened classes. So Dillingham and his commission, they wanted to know whether these immigrants, could they assimilate or not assimilate? Because if different races, maybe they couldn't. Boas immediately accepted the proposal. And he said, I can do it. We will measure the physical changes among recently arrived immigrants in particular, and we will compare the cephalic index of immigrant parents with their children born in the United States. Believe it or not, he got the government to fund him for the then immense sum of $20,000. He and his students subjected 17,821 people in the United States to their calipers and measuring tapes. No government commission had ever carried out a project like this. He reported startling results. The children born in the United States had more in common with other US-born children than with the national group of their parents. There was, in other words, greater plasticity in human types, which human types were considered a category of average physical measurements and an indication of your racial background. But this was plastic. It wasn't permanent. Long-headed people became short-headed, and short-headed people became long-headed. The conditions of life, from diet to environment, were having a quick and measurable effect on head forms that were thought to be fixed, inheritable, and indicative of one's essential type. This was revolutionary because this showed that there was no permanent or fixed racial type. And if physical attributes of the concept of race had no permanence, then it follows that there can be no linkage between a purported race and a package of other traits, such as physical ability, intelligence, moral aptitude, or capacity for civilization, because all of these traits and capacities were felt to cluster together racially. But once he delinked these inner capacities from the physical traits, then the edifice of the racial hierarchy was doomed to collapse. He wrote by now he's 53 years old. Oh, by the way, I should mention that when he submitted his report, the legislators who paid for it completely ignored it and went on to craft immigration policy around the 5 races and to keep the non-white races out. Here, he wrote his first popular book called The Mind of Primitive Man in 1911. And notice it's the mind, because what he's at pains to say is the mentality of pre-modern people are determined not by biology, but by their culture and by their history. So here are some basic points. Historical events have driven civilizational achievement more than inherited biological traits. When we compare all the types of man, we find that innumerable transitions exist, so that features do not come in clusters. Moreover, given that changes in physical features change rapidly over generations, man cannot be assumed to have a stable form. Activities of the human mind exhibit an infinite variety of form among the peoples of the world. Thus, the nature of culture with a capital C can be approached only through the study of individual cultures with a small c. So this distinction is important. Boas and his students were the first to distinguish between culture, which is a universal capacity that involves those 3 levels of material, societal, and symbolic. All cultures, peoples of all cultures have this capacity. It's universal. But their specific cultures work this out in the imagined world of their own making in their own ways. And therefore, to understand them, you must study these cultures in detail to discover what they mean to the people themselves. Okay, here are the broad principles that he bequeathed to anthropology. Cultural relativism. Differences in people result from historical, social, and geographical conditions. So he translated other into different. In other words, it's not another race, it's a different culture. All populations have complete and equally developed culture. There are no universal laws for all cultures. Each culture has a unique history. The concept of different races is not supported by evidence. Conduct field work with methodological rigor. Culture contains superorganic ideas at the collective level. Unconscious assumptions are filters through which reality is perceived. So this became much more prominent in the post-Boasian era, but that anthropologists are keen to try to see the world, the cosmovision, from the inside out among the peoples that they study. Culture is adaptive, so it's not static and frozen in time. And anthropology requires 4 fields. It was Boas who established this permanently in American Anthropology: social and cultural anthropology, archaeology, physical anthropology, and linguistics. His legacy, what he did, Marvin Harris, who wrote a great book on the rise of anthropological theory, he enumerated all the things that Boas did. And as a fellow scholar, he said, this is terrifying. He's the father of modern and American anthropology. The generation of students he trained went on to lead the major anthropology departments of the United States, including Columbia, Berkeley, the University of Chicago, Northwestern, and Yale. He modernized American Anthropologist magazine in 1898. He founded the American Anthropological Association. He revitalized the American Ethnological Society, and he founded the American Folklore Society. He was the gatekeeper of anthropology from his position at Columbia University from 1896 until his death in 1942. By the end, he had become a truly public figure, revered, consulted on every issue of public concern. He wrote 2,500 letters per year. He wrote 6 books and 700 articles. He directed museums and various learned societies. At the end, the rise of Nazi racial ideology drew upon racialist theories and practices in the United States. And I referred to some of those in my opening, but it's probably not a surprise to many of you that the Nazis, funded their students to come and study institutionalized policies to segregate the races, the inferior races in the United States. And Hitler himself, right? Okay, they figured this out in the United States, so we got to study that. So racial mania was surging in the United States. Jewish intellectuals were writing to him and desperately begging him to find a position for Jewish intellectuals to provide lectureships so they could escape Nazi Germany. But the 1924 Immigration Act, based on the 5 races of man, according to quotas, denied them asylum. The Nazis burned his books in bonfires. His university revoked his Ph.D. In 1942, he died in the arms of Claude Lévi-Strauss while giving a speech attacking the Nazis. So he was sad at the end to see that the cause of dismantling the racial hierarchy took hold in a small section of society, but was overwhelmed by racial ideology in Nazi Germany. And that ideology was very, very strong in the United States. And let's see, what time is it? Oh, I think it's 7:50 p.m. I'll just show you some flashes, okay? And I'll stop. Edward Sapir, a genius, a student of Boas. I want you to read this, though. He's a great figure, and he wrote one popular book in 1921. And this is a fascinating book to read today on an introduction to the study of speech. But all the sophistication of this incredible tool of humans of language, all this meets us rigidly perfected and systematized in every language known to us. Many primitive languages have a formal richness, a latent luxuriousness of expression that eclipses anything known to the languages of modern civilization. So the common theme of these armchair anthropologists of the 19th century was that, as Herbert Spencer says, they lack the capacity for abstract concepts. But American linguistics, professional linguistics, and Sapir was the great genius, demonstrated irrefutably the universality of the capacity for symbolic language. Ruth Benedict, the purpose of anthropology is to make world safe for human differences. She was his right-hand man running the department. This was a bestseller. It's probably the most read of all anthropological books. She wrote this about the Japanese. The Office of War Information employed her and used her research to guide the governance of post-war Japan. And unfortunately, I don't have time. I just want you to look at her wonderful face to discuss Zora Neale Hurston, another of his students. And she said this. She discovered after living in poverty and then making it in the big Harlem Renaissance, she said, she was summoned by Boas into his office. And he wanted her to do research in the South. And she said, I was glad when somebody told me you can go and gather Negro folklore. In a way, it would not be a new experience for me. When I pitched foremost into the world, I landed into the crib of Negroism. 100-page article in American Folklore in 1931. She was initiated into secret societies, studying hoodoo. And her masterpiece, The Eyes Were Watching God. I got to say, in preparing for this, I decided I have to know about this person. And I read this. It's unbelievable. You know, her book, Mules and Men, was ethnography informed by science. This is, informed by literature. I'm sorry, ethnography informed by literature. But this is literature informed by ethnography. She recreates the Eatonville of her childhood. Her Ithaca, that was her Ithaca. She kept returning over and over again. And I read it, and then I listened to it, and I recommend this to everybody. It's read by the actress Ruby Dee, and she's got the dialect, and it is unbelievable. And you will see, if you read it and hear it, why it's so anthropological and so profound. So I better stop, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bourgeois. Such beautiful story, and it gives us such an insight when we are talking with our patients. Just to see them from the eyes of curiosity, understanding them, and their language and their speech and the generations, and the impact of that in our relationship with our patients. So is there any question? I think we have time for one question. Dr. Bourgeois, if you stop sharing, we can see.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. See, how do we do that? Stop share. Okay. Sorry about that.
That's fine. So I'm going through pages because I cannot see all people at the same time to see if there is any question. I don't see any question. But
I have a, if you don't have a question, I have a comment that's relative to human services and psychology, like along the lines of what you were just saying, Shiva. I saw a report that was based on the concern in the Department of Children and Families for cultural sensitivity. This is years ago. And it brought out some cases. And one of them was that a male social worker went to a home, and he went to talk to them, and the husband wasn't home, and the wife wouldn't let him in. But the case was under her name because by default they refer all cases to the woman, and there's an assumption that the woman is unmarried, or at least not having a man in the house. And she refused to talk to him, and she said, "You're going to have to come back after 7 p.m. because my husband works." And she was Mexican. And so they have a And so when he came back, he had to come back and talk to him in the evening. In another case, a first-year social worker was wondering aloud whether she should report a family. And she was asked, well, are the children being abused or neglected? She said, no, it's just too loud. They're playing the music loud out in the street. So somebody said, wait a minute. They come from an island in the Caribbean. That's what they do in the Caribbean. This is not abuse and neglect. So so in other words, the point being that it's important to distinguish between, at least to understand cultural norms and practices before barging in and judging. Oh, there was one more case. There was a hard-driven, very intelligent female social worker. And when she got to the husband and wife, she refused to talk to the husband. Because her view was, listen, we've had a women's movement. We're liberated. You can talk. You've got a voice. I want to hear you. And so there was kind of an implicit assumption that this is the way it should be. And the woman later came in for a review with her husband, and she complained about that because she said that, that's not the way we operate. And he should have been included, and he should have been spoken to directly. So these to me are examples of understandable classical cultural mistakes or cultural errors. You usually find out about the rules of another culture by breaking them because they're invisible. And so it takes some time to understand them. So that was my comment.
Very helpful, and our responsibility, our big responsibility when we see our patients. Thank you so much, Dr. Bourgeois.
Thank you very, very much. This is a pleasure. Thank you.
That was excellent. Excellent for us to know that where everything starts and how this story goes on. So, Sydney, would you like to do the closing remarks?
Yes, thank you. So thank you all for joining us this evening. Our next social justice event will take place on January 23rd, 2025, featuring Dr. George Davis as our esteemed speaker. I want to end by emphasizing that our ability to maintain the social justice speaker series relies on fundraising, and we greatly appreciate all donations moving forward. If you want to support, the donation link and mailing address will be available in the chat. And for those registered for CE, I invite you to complete the CE evaluation form to get your certificate, which is also now being added to the chat. Once again, thank you all for joining us this evening.
Thanks again. Thanks, Dr. Bourgeois. Thanks for your participation. Hope you have a great evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.